Look, thank you for coming this afternoon. I want to broach three topics. Obviously, what's going on in West and far west New South Wales. I also wanted to send a shout out to parents with the news that school's going back shortly. But I also wanted to make some comments about the southwestern and western Sydney outbreaks and obviously the very high numbers. But let me start with schools. It has been so difficult for parents homeschooling. I've spoken to a lot of parents and students, and there is no doubt about it, homeschooling has been very difficult. The New South Wales government has talked about a staged return to schools come September, October, more like October. I am sure that that is welcome news for many parents. For those of you that are homeschooling, balancing your work, all the other things you've got to do, and your children at home for such a long period, I really want to say an enormous thank you and pay my deep gratitude and respects to you all. Obviously, we're standing in the electorate of Barton. Much of the electorate of Barton is covered by LGAs that are in severe lockdown, are in what they're calling the red zone. There are many people in the area of southwestern and western Sydney that are feeling very frustrated and very angry and finding it difficult, particularly because of the multicultural nature of our communities, to keep up with the ever-changing messages that are coming out. And it is incredibly important that the New South Wales government in particular understands that messaging is so important. People in the southwest and the western suburbs want to do the right thing. They are attempting to do the right thing, but it is difficult when the messages are so rapidly changing. The final point I'd like to address is what's going on in western New South Wales and far western New South Wales. It is a national emergency. I put to the federal government, call it for what it is. It is a disaster unfolding out there in the west and western Sydney. Every day, including today, you see increased numbers in Dubbo, increased numbers in Bourke, increased numbers in Wilcannia and other parts of the region. There is an urgent need for an assessment of whether or not hospitals can cope and what the contingency plans are for when they're not coping, for transport and for triaging of people that are very sick. 75% of the over 400 cases out there are Aboriginal people. 40% of those people are children under the age of 15. We welcome the announcement by the TGA and Otago that they've approved the vaccine for 12-year-olds on. It is crucial that that vaccine rollout to children be undertaken with absolute urgency out in the west and the western zones of New South Wales. It is so difficult for people that live in overcrowded situations to actually isolate. The federal government needs to put in place immediately the capacity for people to isolate. And I say to the federal government, stop talking about vaccine hesitancy. The people out there want to do the right thing and they need support to do it. Cameron.
Thanks, Linda. Look, in terms of that point you raised about so they don't, essentially so they don't have to isolate in overcrowded housing. Could you go and expand a little bit more?
Most certainly, Cameron. Many of the Aboriginal households out there in particular are overcrowded. This is not a new problem. Overcrowding has been an issue for a very long time. But if there are 15 or 16 people, multi-generational, living in the one home, it is impossible to isolate. And people should not have to set up tents in their front yard, as we're seeing in Wilcannia, for that isolation to take place. Part of what needs to happen in the Western Division of New South Wales is the capacity for people to isolate. And that is an absolute urgency right now. The situation of overcrowded houses means that the virus is going to be passed on, and that's what's taking place out there. And it is impossible to isolate. It is absolutely impossible to isolate when homes are so overcrowded.
Thank you.
Is there any other questions?
Yes, hang on. No, I'll just pop you on speaker.
Cameron, thank you.
Thanks so much.
Okay,
Oh,
Lindy. Lindy Karen from
Oh,
NICD.
hi Lindy, how are you?
Hi, good thanks. How are you going?
I'm well, thanks. You've got my full attention.
Excellent. So look, I guess based on what we're seeing in Wilcannia, how concerned are you about the resources that are available there to deal with the crisis there?
I am deeply concerned about what's happening in Wilcannia. People should not have to put up tents in their front yard to get the ability to isolate. Part of the issue in Wilcannia is incredibly overcrowded houses, which makes it absolutely impossible for people that are close contacts and people that have the virus to isolate. That's number one. Number two, what is the capacity of Wilcannia Hospital, and what are the plans if people need to be evacuated? We saw overnight an evacuation from Broken Hill down to Adelaide, I believe. Now, what happens in Wilcannia? Many of the infections in Wilcannia are young people, children. There needs to be urgent vaccination for young people in Wilcannia. So it's about capacity, it's about isolation, and it's about getting the vaccine rollout to young people. They are the issues that have to be addressed immediately in Wilcannia.
And Linda, we've been hearing for the last year that First Nations people are a priority in the vaccine rollout, that we're always going to be in phase 1B. How would you describe the rollout, given that the vaccination rates in not just Western New South Wales and far Western New South Wales, but in WA, over in Queensland as well, the slow rate of take-up? How would you describe the rollout?
The rollout of vaccines to First Nations communities has been woeful. The federal government can no longer skite that somehow or other we're doing really well in First Nations communities. We are not. The vaccination rate in some communities is something like 2%. In the Pilbara and in the Kimberley, it's about 8%. In far Western New South Wales, it has increased, but it is still way below that of the vaccination rate of the general population. Now, what that says to me, there was no plan. There was absolutely no plan at all in terms of vaccination rates for First Nations people. We were supposed to be in category 1B, and it was all supposed to happen by the beginning of winter. Well, what we're seeing now in Western and far Western New South Wales is a failure of that rollout.
today saying that the protection of Indigenous communities has been one of the most significant national achievements over the last 18 months.
I
That's right.
I find it astounding that the health minister can still claim that the achievements in Aboriginal communities when it comes to COVID has been one of the outstanding successes of the way in which Australia has managed this pandemic. It is patently wrong. Go to Burke, go to Wilcannia, go to Walgett, and go to Dubbo and continue to say that. I challenge you.
At what point is there going to be a need for some sort of inquiry about how this has been rolled out and the huge gaps in vaccination rollout and adequacy of medical responses here?
I have to say that I have not given a great deal of thought to such an inquiry. But it seems to me that the vaccine rollout and what we're seeing unfold in Western New South Wales is an unmitigated disaster. And disasters require examination.
And there has been chatter about the possibility of the Army setting up field hospitals in some of these hardest hit communities. Are you supportive of that approach?
I am very supportive of the idea of a field hospital in a place, say for example Dubbo, where triaging can take place. What we're seeing at Dubbo Hospital is people presenting to the emergency ward and therefore putting everyone in danger. There needs to be a dedicated COVID facility in Dubbo. The infection rates in Dubbo are in their hundreds now. And Dubbo is the logical place that people from the outlying communities would be taken to if they get too unwell. And then from Dubbo you would imagine onto a large teaching hospital in Sydney, which of course are having their own problems. So what we're seeing out there is the brewing of a perfect storm.
All right, thanks, Linda. Anything else?
No, Lindy, that's fine. Thank you so much.